We have Andy joining now and Stevie. So Andy and Stevie are from Fairwinds, and they're here to talk to you about Kubernetes Guardrails using our open source project Polaris, and they're one of, or two of the greatest people that I've worked with. So and we'll jump in if there's any questions or whatnot. But I know Stevie, you'll probably be grabbing questions too. So yeah, off you go.
Coolio. Andy, did you have a slide deck you want to put up?
Yeah, there it is. Thank you.
Hello, slide deck, my old friend. All right, so this talk is getting started with Kubernetes Guardrails with Polaris. Polaris is an open source tool that Fairwinds created, and we're going to talk about using it to create guardrails in Kubernetes. My name is Stevie Caldwell. I am an SRE tech lead here at Fairwinds, and joining me today is Andy Suderman.
Hi, all. I'm Andy, the CTO of Fairwinds, author and maintainer of several of our open source projects, as well as just a huge fan of all things open source and a longtime Kubernetes user.
Right on. So real quick, we're going to just read the Fairwinds mission statement because y'all love it when people read slides out loud to you, I know. So Fairwinds is the trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance. With Fairwinds, customers ship cloud-native applications faster, more cost-effectively, and with less risk. We provide a unified view between dev, sec, and ops, removing friction between those teams with software that simplifies complexity. Back to you, Andy. All right, so today, yeah, we're going to do we're going to demo Polaris for you. We're going to show you how you can use Polaris to create those guardrails in your cluster. Guardrails are important and good to make sure that the workloads you're deploying in your clusters adhere to the policies that you need, depending on what kind of regulations and things you're trying to adhere to, and also just to make sure that you're doing things that you're preventing people from potentially putting insecure settings into your cluster, or doing things that are not cost effective in your cluster. So today, Andy is going to spin up a Kubernetes cluster for us and then show us some tips and tricks with using Polaris. Before we get started, Andy, 2 CPUs walk into a bar, who's buying the drinks?
I don't know.
The one with the most cash.
Nice.
And now we'll get started.
Awesome. Can you switch us to screen share, please, hosts? I don't think I have the ability to do that. Awesome. So let's just dive right in. I think the first thing we need is a cluster. So I'm going to create a kind cluster. If you're not familiar with kind, that is Kubernetes in Docker. It's a great way to just run a really small, lightweight Kubernetes cluster on your machine. If you have Docker installed, which I imagine a lot of us do. So we're going to get that kicked off, and then we're going to install some stuff.
Awesome. I love kind. I also love that it's kindest, because it just feels like a nice, warm, huggy Kubernetes cluster.
Awesome.
Punchy today.
We've got our kind cluster. We've got some nodes. We're going to wait for those to become ready. First, we can talk a little bit about the background of Polaris. I think Stevie talked about guardrails and kind of what that means. But Fairwinds got its start managing clusters for other folks. We've been doing that for about 6 years or so. Still do it today. And, managing hundreds of clusters over all these years, we found that we can build a stable cluster and we can run a cluster, and that's not really a problem. What happens is that our customers deploy things into our cluster and then it breaks. And so generally that means running away with all the CPU on a node, or, doing something insecurely or whatever that is. But there's lots of different things that we would advise them on. And we said, well, what if we had a way to just keep them from doing that? And so Polaris kind of came out of that. So that's the background there. So we have our kind cluster. The first thing I'm going to do is install Cert Manager. We need Cert Manager in place because we're going to do some stuff with webhooks. And so we're going to use that to manage the certificates for the webhooks. So I'll do that first.
All right, so installing Cert Manager and installing the Polaris CRDs.
Right. All right. So then we're also going to install Polaris. So I have an install command here to install Polaris. That is going to install it into the Polaris namespace, and then we're going to flip a couple of flags.
So right away, 2 flags that I see that you're enabling is the set webhook to true and set and mutate to true. So can we talk about what those 2 flags do specifically?
Definitely. So Polaris has the few different ways that it runs. So the first way that it runs is a CLI. You can just download and install Polaris CLI, run it against your clusters, and do what we call an audit, which will run all of the Polaris checks against your cluster. We're not going to focus on that method today. We're installing it into the cluster. So we have 2 things going into the cluster here. We have the dashboard, which we'll show off in just a minute. And then we have the webhook, and this is what those 2 flags enabled. So we're setting up a validating admission webhook and a mutating admission webhook. So if we take a look at the validating webhook configurations and the mutating webhook configurations, we have both for Polaris here. What that does is it enables us to block things from going into the cluster, and it also enables us to automatically mitigate certain issues with Polaris checks. All right, so hopefully those are ready. And we can do a real quick test of this. In this folder here, I have a bunch of YAML, not a bunch, a little bit of YAML, a deployment, an HPA, a pod disruption budget, and a service. These were templated out from a demo Helm chart that we have in our repository. And so I'm just going to go ahead and try and apply these to the cluster. So we're going to apply the Polaris demo folder, and I'm going to get back an error here. It says, Polaris prevented this deployment due to configuration problems. Image tags should be specified, and image tags should be specified. So this is telling me that we violated one of the Polaris rules that's in place, and the validating admission webhook failed that apply.
Wait a second, because you didn't do anything. You just installed it, and now it's telling you, it's tattling and telling you that you got something wrong going on. Why is it doing that? Where is that coming from?
Great question. Great question. So Polaris comes with a bunch of built-in checks, and it comes with a bunch of default configuration for both the admission webhook and the mutating admission webhook and the checks that it runs. And so if we go over here and we take a look at the Polaris documentation, which is on our website, polaris.docs.fairwinds.com, and you go to configuration, you will see that the default Polaris configuration is linked here, and we can go to that and see what the default configuration looks like. And that's probably a little small, so I'm going to make it really big. And so we see here in the configuration, we have a list of checks. And these are all of the built-in checks for Polaris. And we've set these to various levels by default. So we have 3 levels. We have ignore, we have warning, and we have danger. Ignore just does exactly what it says. It completely ignores it. Warning will flag the issue, but it won't block it. And danger is what triggers that admission webhook to block things. And so we see here the tag not specified check is by default a danger level check. And so we're going to block that when we turn on the admission controller. And so we can go in and override any of these. If you're curious about what these checks are, what they mean, we have this in our docs as well. So we have all of our security checks, our efficiency checks, and our reliability checks in place. There's a lot of different stuff in here, replicas, PDBs, HPAs, specifying tags, pull policies, secure capabilities, insecure capabilities, all the stuff that you may be familiar with if you've looked at, enforcing various policies before.
So I know, we at Fairwinds, we've seen a lot of stuff. And so we've written these checks based on the things that we've seen. But what if I, a person working in my company is like, this is a great tool, but who is this Fairwinds? What do they know about what I want to flag in my environment? You mentioned that you can change the severity levels of some of those things. How do you pass in a config that's, maybe in keeping, or how do you change those severity levels?
Great question. Great question. So there's two pieces of that. How do you, kind of deploy your own custom configuration? That's fairly straightforward. If we take a look, I have already pulled down the default values file for this Helm chart. And if you see here at the very top, we have config null. And by default, it'll pull in that example config, that default config that we were looking at. So we can take and put in a Polaris configuration inline on our values file here and completely override every single setting that's in that default config. And so I have here my own values file where I have that config, and I can go in here and start to set all these different things. So for example, if I only wanted to warn on that tag not specified, I could modify that. I could do a, it's over here. We could install Polaris and remove these set flags from the Helm install and just say values and point that at our values file. And let's take a look and make sure that I left the webhook on, which I did. So we have webhook enabled true, validate true, mutate true. And so now that should reconfigure the admission webhook to not fail on that tag not specified error. So that's the first question you asked.
Yep. And then the second, well, let's back up 1 second. So what is Polaris? Polaris comes with a few controllers that it checks by default. So it checks deployments and stateful sets and that sort of thing. What if you have third party or custom controllers that you also want to check with Polaris?
Great question. So by default, the way Polaris discovers those controllers is that it looks at the pods in your cluster and then walks the ownership tree to find what owns that pod. So you could write checks against other things as well. It could be anything that creates a pod. But so if we can start to talk about custom checks here and how those are defined. And I think the best way to start that is to take a look at the documentation again. I think there's a lot of great documentation here. But we have examples of how you write your own custom checks. And the way we write those in Polaris is with JSON schema. And so here we have JSON schema that specifies where your images have to come from. So this one says all of our images need to come from a repository that starts with quay.io. And so we are going to say that we're targeting the container spec. And so that will be inside of whatever we're looking at here. But this is the container spec inside of a pod spec that we're targeting. And we're going to say the property image has to be a type string, which that's by default, but then it cannot, this actually says we cannot pull images from anything from Quay. So if you wanted to block an entire registry from being deployed, so that would say pattern not Quay.io. But JSON schema is well documented. If you can write a schema that validates a YAML, then you can write a Polaris check. So a little bit easier sometimes for some folks than writing Rego checks if you're using OPA. But that's how our custom checks work.
That's really cool. That seems like there's a lot of flexibility in there. So are you going to show us one of these custom checks in that? No. That's so disappointing.
Nope.
We're done.
Yep. So we did come up with a few examples of custom checks that you might want to use or that teams might want to use. So the first one is I took that image registry example and modified it a little bit. So here we have a list of registries that containers are allowed to come from. And so we have basically an allow list of these are all the different registries we trust and the places we expect images to come from. So this looks very similar to the ones we were just looking at, but I have done a couple of different things. One, I've set the category to Fairwinds custom. This is kind of a neat little accidental feature, as it were, because I don't think we originally intended it to do this, but this allows us to put all of our custom checks under a specific heading in the dashboard, which we'll show in just a second. Again, we're going to target that container spec. We're going to say the image property of that container spec, And here I now, instead of having not, I have any of, and I have a list of various patterns that are allowed. So we're going to allow, docker.io kindest, because that's where our kind control plane comes from. We've got GCR, because that's where a lot of Kubernetes components come from. We've got our Quay repository, the Fairwinds Quay repository, and then we also have Jetstack for the cert manager images that we've already pulled. And so this should have already been applied. So we've got this custom checks section of our config. We have this image registry check. And then if we go up here and look again under our config checks, we have configured this custom check to be the level danger. And I'm actually going to switch that over to warning. And I'm actually going to put all of these to warning to start with. And this is because I don't know what's going to fail, right? I'm adding a new custom check. I'm maybe doing this in a live cluster. I don't want to block everybody from being able to deploy to this cluster. So I'm actually just going to replace all the dangers with warning, except for that one.
Danger zone.
There we go. Okay. There's a check name with dangerous in it. I don't want to replace that. So I'm going to put all of these to warning, and we're going to go ahead and apply this to our cluster. And we're going to keep an eye on that. We should see the admission webhook rollover as we update its configuration. So once we have new pods, I'll go ahead and try applying that YAML again, and it should pass because now we've set all of the admission stuff to warning. So let's just, I don't want to do it yet because if the pods aren't done rolling over, then it will probably reject me.
Oh, that's sad.
Okay. Oops. I think I messed up my config. The demo gods are unhappy.
They're still being generous. It could be worse.
All right. So you can see, if you misconfigure your configuration, you'll get some errors explaining why. In that case, I tried to set the severity for a check that didn't exist.
Because the pattern is you have to create the check and then you have to add it. There's a two-step process. You have to actually obviously create the check, but then you also have to include it in the list of checks that exist or
correct.
that are in the file. Yeah.
Correct. Then I had to go delete the validating webhook configuration to make my Helm upgrade work. Let's just get rid of it for the moment. So this is a danger of validating webhook configurations. If you mess up your configuration and it's rejecting things, you might not be able to deploy to fix it. And so in this case with Polaris, I can just delete Polaris and we'll reinstall Polaris, and hopefully that will come back okay for us. And so we'll put up our little watch again, which I'm just gonna.
And this is kind of a good brief side step because we don't talk about it a whole lot, but Polaris does, as we saw in the command that you passed in, it does do mutating webhooks. So it can actually change some things, like if you want to just automatically change an image pull policy to always or something like that if someone submits the workload to the cluster. But that can have some weird side effects and could cause some unexpected things in your cluster. So even though it's there, you want to be careful about deploying those kinds of things, deploying mutating webhooks, because even with validating webhooks, you can get into trouble.
Definitely. I'm glad you mentioned the mutating webhook. We can talk about that real quick. There's only one check that by default has a mutation, and that is the image pull policy check, which is set to always set everything to always, because that's always a good idea. I'm going to see if I can say always about 5 more times in the sentence. But that is the one default mutation that's enabled. And if we look at the YAML that I have just submitted to the cluster, we see that the image pull policy is if not present. And then if we take a look at our demo namespace, actually, take a look at our pods here in the default namespace that I just created with that YAML, we should see that the image pull policy has been set to always. So that was done by the admission webhook. So if we take a look at our config again, our values, we see mutate is set to true, and then we see the mutations list. These are the lists of checks that are allowed to mutate. This is the pull policy, not always mutation. And then if we go look at our checks in the Polaris repo, because all of the checks that are included by default are also in here as JSON schema in these YAML files, we'll see that we've added this mutations section. So we have the schema that we were just talking about to write your custom checks, and then we have this mutations. So we're going to add image pull policy always to all of our pods as they get created in the cluster. So that's the quick bit about mutations. So I think now it's probably good that we go look at the dashboard, because we haven't done that yet, and it's kind of a big deal.
It's very pretty.
Is all right. So this is the Polaris dashboard. I just did a port forward to the dashboard in the Polaris namespace. It's going to give you a quick score, which is just like the percentage of passing checks. Dangerous checks get higher weight, but because we set all of our settings to warning, we have no dangerous checks at this point. We will see here the list of checks. So we have the efficiency checks, the Fairwinds custom checks, which we were just talking about, and then the reliability and security checks. And we see here we have a bunch of different namespaces. And so we just deployed that demo app into the default namespace. So I'm going to change the dashboard to just show that default namespace so that we can kind of look in on that a little bit closer. And we see here that we are passing the, what was it? Image from allowed registries check, the one that we just created. But we are failing the check to specify an image tag because we're still using the latest tag.
Okay.
So you can see all your different policies, which ones you're passing, which ones you're failing. If it's a built-in check, this link will take you straight to the docs for that particular check. So if we wanted to know, like, why should I specify my image tag? We can go straight to the docs here and take a look at that.
So it's interesting. So first, I like a good dashboard, right? And I think this is a good one because a dashboard is a really easy, quick way to just get like a quick top-down view into your cluster and see immediately like the health of it, what you need to work on, right? And then click on those values to find out more information. What I notice is that, for example, I'm going to use image pull policy because it's just the one that I think of immediately. So if you submit a workload into your cluster that has image pull policy set to if not present, and you have the mutating webhook on, then it will mutate that deployment or the pods, and your pods will have those that set, but your source and it won't trigger then an alert in like it won't fail that check in Polaris, or will it fail that check in Polaris?
It will not fail that check in Polaris.
Right. So it won't fail the check
here.
Yeah. Okay. So it won't fail the check in Polaris, and your source code is still like setting it to. So that's one of the things to be careful about, especially if you're doing something like GitOps or something like that, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because like, especially if you're doing something with GitOps where you have like an auto sync policy, right? Mm-hmm. Your repo says, if not present, your in cluster state says that you have always, because we just modified it. So it's probably going to trigger a constant resync loop trying to do that over and over again, which is definitely something to be careful with. So mutating webhooks are not something that you want to just kind of willy-nilly throw around, and because they can definitely be dangerous and cause unexpected issues. Same with validating admission webhooks, right? And that's more of an issue of just like blocking things and getting in the way of folks.
Being annoying.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But,
Why is this thing not deploying?
Exactly. So
we have should I tell you a question that we have in the
sure.
comments? So we have a question. Can those overview values from the dashboard be exported as Prometheus metrics as well?
That's a great question. I don't believe they can be, but that would be like a really cool enhancement request. And if it's not there, please go open it and we can take a look. Or if anybody wants, it's Hacktoberfest time. So if anybody wants to get a Hacktoberfest PR in, be happy to work with someone on getting that in. So great question.
Yep. And so, speaking of that, if, there's what would you suggest people do? We're talking about creating custom checks. What would you suggest people do if they create a custom check and they think, this might be like a good check, like this might be valuable for other people?
Pull requests are always welcome, and suggestions for new checks always welcome as well. So the github.com/fairwindsops/Polaris repo, where we keep the Polaris code, is open, and please go file issues or pull requests, or both, and issue then a pull request, and we'd love to see it. I think we're just about out of time if there's not any more questions.
Do we go to 105 or to 1?
We have to 105, but I can ask you a few probing questions. The first one is, this is really interesting stuff. Do you have any other open source tools that Fairwinds might have put together?
No.
This is the only thing we do.
We have quite a lot of open source. So we have Polaris, so we just talked about, for doing policies. We have Goldilocks for helping you set your resource requests and recommendations, and now also to take a look at some of your costs in your cluster. Recently released feature. We are also the authors and maintainers of Pluto, which helps you find deprecated API versions in your cluster if you're doing cluster upgrades and you want to know what's going to get you in trouble later. We've got a couple RBAC related projects that are super useful. And then we also have Nova, which isn't on this front page for some reason, and that needs to change. But Nova is for finding outdated things in your cluster, like containers or helm charts.
And we were talking about Nova recently because you were helping me out and explaining to me, like, with Kubernetes and the latest upgrade, like 1.21 is gonna stop being able to be used or something like that, and that Nova is super important, like, coming up, right? You want to help people out with that one? Do you remember our conversation?
Or are we talking about Pluto here?
Pluto.
So we recently upgraded most of our clusters to 1.22. We're going to be moving through the 23 and 24 and 25 cycle relatively soon. There are lots of APIs being removed, API versions being removed in 1.25. And then there's also a lot in 1.22 that were removed. So Pluto is super helpful there. Nova is useful all the time, regardless of what version of Kubernetes you're moving to and from. So definitely take a look at it.
Awesome. I got to ask this question, and I know we're here to talk about open source, and that's absolutely why we're here. But if I wanted to get all of these open source tools in one platform, is that possible?
That's leading questions.
I know, right?
Yes, obviously, not obviously, but Fairwinds definitely has a commercial offering called Fairwinds Insights. And it allows you to take in information from all of these tools, as well as other best of breed open source tools like Trivy and KubeHunter and KubeSec, and pull those into one dashboard and handle all of those different findings in a normalized way with lots of integrations and automations. That's awesome. My 30-second pitch.
Thank you. And I know that. I know everyone. I did that to us. Andy, Stevie, thank you so much for being here this morning. We will, hopefully you'll hang around for a few minutes. If there's any questions, you can hit them up in the chat. And thank you for being here.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely
Have
post those links in the chat. So it's easy for people to know how to get involved, where to get involved, and any of the links that you mentioned. It's just, we like to type them in so people can just click and go directly there.
Ooh, there is a question that just came in. Are there ambitions to put Polaris under the CNCF umbrella?
Not at this time. It is something we have discussed, but not at this time.
Or any other governing body. We shouldn't be totally partial. There's others out there.
There are. We do as a team, because obviously now I'm the Fairwinds team, we do debate it kind of quarterly, like should we not, should we? But
we could have a whole talk on the pluses and minuses of joining a foundation for your project. Big plus, lots of marketing and inertia and things that get behind it and visibility. I would say biggest plus. And then we go from there.
Yeah.